Hi, Larry.
Mr. President.
How are you?
Well, sir, you.
Pretty good. I'm already wired up here, so you all can get wired. Hi. You know these are for you as much as for us. Now I have to... Yeah, there. I got myself tangled up. Y'all walked away.
We leave you here by yourself?
Huh?
Did we leave you here by
Yeah.
yourself?
Sure.
These are, in case you have any problems, as you know,
All right, thank you.
available.
Well, and as you know, sir, this is going to be for the Monday magazine, which will have a large story on your new campaign.
Well, let me, because I wish it were Monday instead, so that we're doing this right. I know the type of things you want to ask, and let me just say to you, you are going to ask the questions on the assumption that I am, so I will answer in the context of your assumption.
Okay.
But I am not going to say those magic words one way or the other.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, then, I will slightly reword this first question. Impossible. The first question was when you decided to run, and whether you consulted with many advisors and friends, or was it just with Mrs. Reagan?
Well, I can answer that question regardless of which way the decision would be, can't I? That when did I make a decision that I'm going to announce on Sunday night? Only recently. I've actually held off as long as I could, not only in the announcement, but in actually approaching the decision and whether to make it, because I just felt that there were so many things going on that I did not want to put myself in a frame of mind where I might be using political considerations or shading my decisions with political considerations. The only person I talked it over with at all was Nancy, because we always do everything together. And it would be, I think, impossible for either one of us to go off on our own, make some decision, and just tell the other one about it after the fact. But she's been a party to all of this and this thinking, and yet, even together, we have many times I just said, well, we would talk about it later.
Did you have any reservations when it came to making the decision about not seeking another 4 years here?
Well, the decision by waiting, no, the decision then, the things that I have felt were essential to a decision were all known factors by then. I have always said that the people tell you whether you should or should not seek office. And you can't ask them to do that too early. You've got to wait a considerable time until you can say that you believe you have a reading from the people. And so that is one thing. Then there were other considerations for others that whether you were or were not, there were things that had to be gotten underway, such as a campaign organization. But I felt on that I could let that go forward without my still having made a decision, because there would be such an organization needed for some candidate in our party. And so that organization started without any word from me as to what the answer would be.
I meant by reservations, the longing to go back to California, or maybe being able to be a private citizen again, or get out from the burden of this office, or was it just were there no reservations like that to your decision?
Well, there would be some mixed emotions about that. There's no question about my love for California and the life that we lead when we're there. But on the other hand, you speak of the burdens, there's another thing. There's a desire to see things through, to not duck and run. Just because the the load is heavy. So the private citizen thing, I guess some of those things, I had already had that experience for 8 years in Sacramento with no thought of ever going beyond that. That I'd had to deal with all of those things, the private citizen thing or not private citizen before. So that wasn't unusual. It was a familiar experience.
There was a lot of published stuff to the effect that Mrs. Reagan was very reluctant to go through another campaign. Can you tell us whether, in effect, you had to persuade her, or was this liberated mutual consent?
No, I think that our thinking kind of tracked together. That yes, you can dread something, or you can and think back to unpleasant features in previous campaigns, and hope against hope that those things won't happen again. But no, as I say, we both knew it was a decision that had to be made. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're either going to have to say you're going home, or you're going to try to stay. And yet we both had the same feeling that we didn't talk about it, that we didn't think the time had come yet to talk about it, and that when the time had come, we would have all the information that we needed to know in making the decision.
But do you remember the date you wrote in your diary, this is it, it's all wrapped up? We were talking about a week ago, 10 days ago.
I'm so afraid of leaks. I haven't written it in my diary yet. I'll write it Sunday night.
You'll have to predate it. All right, well, not ducking out on the burden, not cutting and running, as you said. In a capsule, what would your 2 or 3 highest priorities be in the second term? The business you most feel you want to finish?
Oh, the economic recovery, which means getting back to a situation in which this government spends within its means, that we have a recovery that isn't like the several that we've had since World War II, in which we're off on wrong economic policies that get us into trouble, and then we artificially stimulate the economy to get out of that particular trouble, but lay the foundation for another recession 2 or 3 years down the road, so that we've had 8 now since World War II. No, to have what I think we have embarked on, and that is well underway, and that is a sound economy based on sound principles, and to see that through. Then in the international scene, I think that we've made great progress, and I would like to see us continue until there is a feeling that we have peace throughout the world, that we have reduced the danger that is brought about by the excessive armament in the world, that we've actually been able to reduce, not just have agreements that said, well, we won't build them as fast as we used to build them, which is what most of the agreements have been up until now, but to actually disarm. And I would hope that going down that path we could see an end to nuclear weapons, that the world would recognize what we tried to achieve in 1946, when we basically were the only ones who had them, and yet we couldn't persuade the Soviet Union to go along with the total elimination of those weapons. That I am vitally interested in having a relationship with our friends and allies below the borders, the southern border, that we've touched upon in times past, but we never have really had the kind of partnership and friendly relation that we as nations here in the Western Hemisphere, who have so many beliefs in common, should have. And this, as you recall, I started very early in the first year that I was here, and I want to carry on with that. I think we've made great progress there. But you could sum it all up in a sound economic situation here in our own country, with the structural reforms that are needed to put us on the right track, peace in the world, and with that, and maybe even bringing it about, would be the sizable reduction in weapons.
Mr. President, turning to the campaign itself, the special interest groups in the Democratic Party seem to be galvanized as never before. It seems to be as much an anti-Reagan movement as a pro-Mondale movement, for example. How do you account for yourself being the lightning rod for so much of this?
Well, I think what you're talking about when you say special interest groups.
Organized labor, teacher, women's groups.
Well, not all of those, some of all of those, but I think anytime you have a special interest group, they see government only from the vantage point of their particular interest, without seeing the whole picture and how you can reconcile the interests of one with the interests of all the others in this country. And so when you set out, as we did, to try to make government more efficient and more economical and solve the great economic problem that had brought us into the depths of that recession, a Democratic Senator, Long, has described it as he said the policy is don't cut you and don't cut me, cut that fellow behind the tree. Well, we're all the fellows behind the tree if you look at it. And at the same time, since we have elections every 2 years, and since we have a system in this land that is so unique, in which you can have a president of one party and have the opposing party hold a majority in one or both houses of the legislature, then it is politics are made. Demagoguery is a common practice, and politics are made out of these things in trying to enlist the people. Now, the truth of the matter is, many of these supposed special interest people are crying and they haven't been hurt, because we are doing more for the poor and the needy, the handicapped and people of this kind, and education than has ever been done before. We think that in many instances in those programs, what those special interests have become is a kind of bureaucracy that is no longer looking at the original goal of benefiting their clients who needed help. They now want to make sure that they will always have those clients, so that they, in that bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy can spread from government to becoming private special interest groups, that their own jobs and careers will be safe. For example, let me just put it in the round term of welfare. Shouldn't the intelligent and moral position of government with regard to welfare be that we must have programs aimed at getting people free of welfare to where they are self-sufficient and no longer needing government help? Granted, there will always be some people that, through no fault of their own, must depend on others for help. But suddenly, when you have an organization built up, they don't envision at all being without those clients, because then they look and say, where would I be? What would I do? And so they see, no matter how well-intentioned they are, they see all the problems through that distorted glass of maintaining that clientele where they are. They're their excuse for being.
Another campaign-related question, and that focuses on you, which is that the polls show that an increasing number of people seem to be worried about that the world is less safe than it was when you came into office.
I know.
And the people are worried that you still might get us into a war somehow. How do you account for this attitude toward you personally that still seems to be out there and maybe even on the rise, if we're to believe the polls?
Well, could I bluntly say that I think that those who, for political reasons, profit by that misperception about me maybe have more access to media channels than we do. It isn't true. We are safer, we are stronger, and peace is more assured today than it has been in recent years. There have been 4 wars in my lifetime. We never got into one of them because we were too strong. We got into the 2 major wars because the other people thought we wouldn't fight and that they could do anything to us, and they pushed beyond the point in which, not out of pride or anything, out of sheer necessity. When you were attacked, as we were attacked, with an all-out military assault, you're in a war. That was World War II. Woodrow Wilson held out for 4 years in the face of all kinds of provocations and assaults upon our rights in World War I. And his program was called a program of watchful waiting. And then in the second term, believing that nothing could provoke us to defend ourselves, they did go too far, and we were in World War I.
Well, Mr. President, you say that your critics on this subject have more access to the media. Having covered a number of administrations, it seems to me that the President always has maximum access. Everything you say can get on the air, get into print, and you have a well-earned reputation of being a very fine communicator. Those 2 facts being as they are, I'm just wondering if there aren't other elements in this business of you being perceived as reckless overseas. I mean, after all, we do have troops in Lebanon who are getting, some of whom tragically have been killed, and you have been much tougher than your immediate predecessor, at least, in foreign affairs. Isn't that part of it?
Well, what I was trying to point out earlier was that not being strong and not even having the means to be strong, which was true of us so many years in the past, then led to someone taking advantage to the point that whether we wanted it or not, we were in a war. Now, would World War II have occurred if the people of Europe and the people of England had listened to Winston Churchill instead of ignoring him until it was too late, and then they turned to him as the man to help them out of their dilemma? Would World War II have happened if the opposition to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's desire to enhance our armed strength, had he been heeded, with all the things that he was able to accomplish, with a legislature that was in both houses was of his party? He was never given the armament that he asked for. Had we been capably armed, would Pearl Harbor ever have happened? We've been told since that war by men on the opposite side, leaders on among our opponents, we've been told since that it was precisely because they saw us not arming and not prepared that they thought they could do that. Now, when I say access to the media, Larry, yes, a president can. But also, Lyndon Johnson once expressed it when a particular senator was, and of his own party, was belittling him and attacking him constantly. And Lyndon said, anyone can get themselves in the news and the press if they attack the president. And it's true. Now, you say, flattering remark about communicator. I've watched the news sometimes on the air on addresses that I've made, and yes, they show me coming into the hall, and they show me up there speaking. Maybe one sentence aloud is on sound, but then I see myself silently speaking while some commentator goes on for 40 seconds telling the people what he says I said. they don't let the people hear what I said.
Do you think some of the TV news coverage of your statements not as full and fair as you'd like to see them? Is that a short version of it?
Well, I suppose anyone would feel that it's only full and fair if they quoted everything that you said. But and no, and I wouldn't, and I don't mean to go that far, and I wouldn't say that. But what I do believe is that the drumbeat, as we said before, like the special interest groups. So suddenly, a large segment of the population is convinced that I'm a warmonger. I campaigned on the basis of exactly what I'm trying to do, and that is arms reduction, to get the powers of the world together and reduce the number of weapons in the world, not set a limit on how many more we can build, which is what most of the agreements set out to do, reduce them. And I have made it plain here and abroad, and I said it to the Diet in speaking to them in Japan. My goal in my dreams is the total elimination of nuclear weapons.
Larry says you only have 5 minutes left or so, so there's a couple of things we felt were really essential.
I have a couple of questions on your management style here in the office. One is that some observers say that you delegate so much to the staff sometimes that you're not fully aware of maybe as much as you should be here. And one example of that seems to be the original order you signed to apply lie detectors to what would have been your Secretary of State and other members of the NSC. And when that was pointed out to you, you changed that order so it wouldn't necessarily direct a polygraph to those people. And looking back at that example, do you have a sense sometimes that you're not always fully aware
No,
of things
I'm
that come
aware that
before you?
there may be some details many times that I don't think you can be aware of, and anyone who tries to be is not going to be able to do this job. But the very thing that you mentioned there, here again, we were all convinced that the violation of the particular meeting, the secrecy of that meeting, which had to do with national security, that was a criminal violation. And therefore, when I asked for an investigation by the FBI, that would have been a criminal and was a criminal investigation. Under a criminal investigation, the use of the polygraph is permissible to the law enforcement authorities without my saying yes or no to it. As they progressed with, and without ever using the polygraph, as they progressed with the investigation, they themselves came to me and the investigators and said they did not believe that it could be considered a criminal investigation, that our first supposition that the national security had been violated was not substantiated. So therefore there was no question of anyone using the polygraph, and unless they had said that I could, unless I wanted to order it.
But you did originally.
No, I ordered it only on the basis that was part of a criminal investigation. And on this, if we're talking about the same investigation, and when they came back to me on that, well, I said, well, no, then. I won't order that if this is not a criminal investigation.
Well, how about the example of, I believe there's a meeting with Senator Nunn and Cohen over the bill-down question to be incorporated in the START. And you mentioned to them that, and this was last fall, and you mentioned that you had only recently realized that the Soviet strategic forces were heavily dependent on heavy land-based missiles, and that therefore no wonder the Soviets would have looked at your original START proposal as being lopsided or maybe unfair. How is it that 3 years into your administration you would just come to that bit of information?
That was
it
not
seems
me
like a basic fundamental.
No, that was not
kinda.
me alone. And that was all of our negotiators in discussing this. We'd come to the conclusion that the destabilizing weapon, the thing that has, if there's going to be nightmares for our children that have them, are those missiles that you push the button, those land-based missiles, and they take off, and 20, 30 minutes later, the world blows up. And therefore, we know that both sides have got bombs that airplanes can drop. We know they've got missiles and submarines, and we have too. What we emphasized were those others, because they were the ones, push the button and that's it, no calling them back. There's less terror of the conventional craft carrying these missiles, the submarine that must travel out there and can be intercepted, the airplane that can be intercepted, that we're used to airplanes that dropped explosive bombs, but that can now drop nuclear weapons. They can also be called back if there is some reason to call them back. So we said that really destabilizing ones, the ones that we should reduce the threat of, are these land-based. And none of us, until the Soviets brought it up, because they're building all these other things too. In fact, they have been building submarines faster than we have. None of us thought that they would introduce, it never occurred to us, a charge that we were trying to dictate their mix of weapons and therefore their strategy. And when we looked at it, and we did, and we realized where we're placing ours in what we call a triad, submarine, air-based, land-based, so that an enemy in trying to have a deterrent to us or an enemy threatening us must have to be able to plan for knocking out 3 systems, not just one. They, on the other hand, have based their greatest reliance on the land-based. And they brought this up. And when they brought that issue up, I looked when it was brought back, they had brought this up and said, well, no, it never had occurred to any of us. We always expected that we were going to negotiate all 3 systems, but we were going to start. And we made it plain at the start that we were starting to talk about the land-based, but then we'd move on to phase 2 and 3 with the others. The Soviets did not take to that, took this position that they had the greater number on land, and this was a tactic of theirs, and we were trying to change, as I say, their strategy. And I said, well, then let's change. If that's the way they want to do it, then we're not trying to change their strategy.
But was it a staff failing or your misunderstanding in the first place? You didn't
No,
know that
I don't
that
think-
information had been out there for
Even-
years before you came in, that they were heavily dependent on
It had
the
never
land-based
really
missiles.
been pointed up. All we knew was that, it's harder to know how many bombs they're making. They've continued to make more airplanes than we have. They continue to have more bombers than we have. And we know they were building submarines faster than we were. So it never occurred to us that just the fact that they were further ahead in their strategic land-based weapons than they were in these other phases, that this was a planned strategy that they intended to hold to. And maybe it still isn't, because they're still building those other things as fast as they can. So when they made that an issue, well, then we immediately proved that we were flexible. We said, well, if that's an issue that, in other words, they do not want to take the land-based as the first negotiating position and then the others later, okay, then we'll take them all up. We'll take the total number of weapons up and negotiate on that basis. No, I don't think that was a case of lacking a knowledge of details. I don't think that, I never heard anyone of our negotiators or any of our military people or anyone else bring up that particular point.
Maybe we should wind this up on a philosophical note or reflective note as you
Could
contemplate.
I, before you get into it though, could I go back to your previous question, previous to this one, on the matter? You mentioned Lebanon and our Marines in Lebanon, in keeping with your question on whether I'm warlike or using force more. Remember that the multinational force was there at the request of the government of Lebanon as an aid in peacemaking. It was a part of our overall peace proposal for the Middle East, where we hoped that we could bring the Arab states and Israel together to do as Egypt and Israel had done and continue the Camp David peace process. And the roof blew off in Lebanon with the Israelis crossing the border, admittedly in their own defense because of the terrorist attacks that had been made across their borders, their northern border, with the Syrians also in there, with the rival factions internally that had been fighting a kind of civil war within the country for several years. And this was all aimed at getting the foreign forces to withdraw and standing by while Lebanon, which hadn't really had a government for several years, reinstated its sovereignty and its ability to protect itself. And so we were part of a multinational force that was there not for combat purposes, but to offer some stability. And for the better part of a year, practically a year, this is what it was and how it worked. And it was only as they began to make progress, scheduled meetings in Geneva and so forth, last August, that the terrorist attacks began against the multinational force. They can force us to withdraw from what we think is a legitimate peacemaking function. So now, go ahead with your next question.
Well, as you contemplate certainly the strong possibility of another 5 years here, counting the last year of this term, what are your reflections about the job? What does it do to you as a man? Is there a danger of being cut off from the real world? If you had a magic time machine that you could go back for a few decades, is there anything different you would do to prepare yourself for this job?
Well, there might be something of that kind, because believe me, I never, in my wildest dreams, ever aspired to public service. I loved the world that I was in, the entertainment world. I did always believe that you had to pay your way, so the very fact that I'd been blessed with some success and could attract an audience and so forth, I thought that it was only right that I should use that in behalf of causes that I believed in, so I used to campaign for others. But I never entered my mind that I wanted to hold public office. I didn't want to. Matter of fact, I was the most reluctant candidate in the world when finally I was persuaded to seek the governorship and did. I have to say, however, that after it happened, and Nancy and I were both very reluctant, thought that we were going into a life that we would not like at all, we found after several months that it was probably the most fulfilling and exciting thing we'd ever done. So I don't know what I could have done or would have done differently. In fact, I'm not sure that people really do plan or should plan to go into public office. Maybe it's better to simply achieve something in what you're doing out there, and your neighbors tell you whether you should serve them by way of public office.
Has the experience changed any of your views that you held when you came in, as you watch the world work now from this perspective?
No, not really, because of that 8 years as governor of the largest state in the Union. I think in other words, there weren't too many surprises here. There were some, but they weren't the kind of surprise of having to change your thinking or anything. They were surprises of some of the requirements, such as finding that you can't go a half an hour away from the White House, like saying going out for an evening or something, without having a phone system established so that you were still, wherever you are in instant communications if need be with the world. That was hard to get used to, and hard to get used to that, like a State of the Union address, that there is, if there is believed to be a security threat to a place where you are, and other members of the government are going to be there, including those people who are in the line of succession if anything happens to you, that one of the line of succession must not go and attend that meeting.
Sam Pierce?
Huh?
Sam Pierce?
No, Sam was out of the country, so he didn't count. There had to be another cabinet member.
Who was out?
I don't know whether I'm supposed to tell which one didn't go, but let me just say one cabinet member was notified that he was here in the city. He could not attend that particular affair.
How about on foreign policy, though? The governorship really didn't prepare you so much for that. Have there been things that have happened there that have changed your views?
Well, let me just put on that on foreign policy. No, you don't have a foreign policy as a governor, and yet you find yourself, if it's a state like California, there on the rim of the Pacific, you find that you do have much more contact with foreign governments just because of the interest of your own state. For example, California, if it were a nation, would be the, well, when I was governor, it was the 7th. Some have said now that it's changed, it would be the 8th. Would be the 7th ranking, at that time would have been the 7th ranking economic power in the world. We are the exit and entrance point for a tremendous percentage of all of our world commerce. So you were a little exposed to foreign relations. But beyond that, myself personally, I'd been on the mashed potato circuit since I didn't sing or dance. When anyone asked me to make a personal appearance in the business that I was in before, it was to be a speaker. And I never made a canned speech. I always thought that I'd wanted to speak on things that interested me. And I was interested in foreign affairs. And as a matter of fact, at one time, running for governor the first time, there were some members of your trade who wrote that if I didn't stop talking about world affairs, I couldn't be elected governor, that I should begin interesting myself in the domestic problems of the state. I thought it was a little unfair. I wasn't talking that much about it, but it was true that my interests were in that line. And so that wasn't so much of a shock or a switch when I got here. It was, I did find, I had underestimated how much of your time would be devoted to that. My main interest was in trying to get the economy going again and so forth, and I have been surprised by the extent to which your day, every day, is involved with world affairs. But you'd asked something else there just before about...
I had asked what it does to you as a man, and do you feel that there's danger of being cut off from the real world?
No, that I wanted to answer, because I know there are many people that say that and try to portray the presidency as that you're isolated in such a way that you just don't have any contact with human beings and you don't know what people are thinking about. I have never felt that once. First of all, I see an awful lot of my mail, but all the previous years before getting here, I still know all those people. And I don't mean just close friends, but the kids I went to school with, the people in my hometown, the people I knew in Hollywood, and I don't just mean movie stars, I mean the people in the studios, the crews, the fellows that you worked with. I still feel a contact with all of them, but also there's another thing in this job. You're surrounded by people, and not just cabinet members or ambassadors. You're surrounded with all the people that work here, the people that do the things in the White House with the security people and all. You get to know them. You get to know about their families and what their problems are too. And then, of course, no matter what security does, and granted that you can't ride in an open car anymore, or go down and walk out into a strange and unchecked crowd, but you still have a contact when you go any place to speak, like yesterday in Atlanta. You still meet a number of those people, and they're pretty representative of the whole group. And I've never felt that estrangement. What you do feel is a personal loss. You find yourself remembering what it was like when on the spur of the moment you could just yell to your wife that you were going down to the drugstore and get a magazine, and you can't do that anymore. Things of that kind. I've often told, I've made up a joke and told about that the first week after I left the governor's office. I've told it as if it were true. I've said that Nancy and I, we were going out one evening, and we went out, and both of us got in the back seat of the car and waited for somebody to drive us.
Mr. President, thank you.
All right.
We appreciate it.
Thanks, Len.
Okay, you bet. Oops.